In the summer of 1816, a French naval expedition left Rochefort for Senegal, carrying soldiers, officials and settlers as part of a mission meant to restore colonial control after years of war and political upheaval. At the centre of the convoy was the frigate Méduse, moving through the Atlantic under command decisions that appeared routine on departure, yet would soon drift toward waters where charts were uncertain and the sea offered no clear warning of what lay beneath. As you follow this story, you will see how a documented voyage begins to fracture through survivor testimonies, official reports, and fragmented accounts that describe a grounding, an evacuation, and a raft pushed into open ocean. What emerges is not a single moment of disaster, but a chain of decisions recorded in hindsight, where authority, confusion, and survival overlap in ways that still resist a simple explanation. The captain who had not sailed in decades. In the summer of 1816, the Atlantic carried more than ships between continents, because along the docks of Rochefort, France, preparations were underway for a journey that seemed, at least on paper, routine, official, and quietly hopeful. The Bourbon monarchy had returned after years of revolution and war. France was rebuilding shattered colonial ambitions, and one naval vessel among a small expedition prepared to sail toward the coast of West Africa carrying soldiers, officials, settlers, and supplies meant to restore French authority in Senegal. Nothing in those crowded preparations openly suggested disaster, yet around the frigate Medusa lingered the uneasy presence of something harder to see. The kind of misjudgment that settles into important decisions long before consequences begin to unfold at sea. In naval administration of the period, such expeditions were often treated as both logistical operations and political statements, meaning that symbolism could quietly influence decisions that would later depend entirely on technical precision. Behind the movement of crates, uniforms and official papers stood a country attempting to reorder itself after the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, and in that tense political climate, loyalty often carried unusual weight. When King Louis XVI returned to power, royalist sympathisers who had remained loyal to the Bourbon monarchy during years of upheaval found themselves rewarded with restored influence, titles, and military appointments. Institutions that had once been shaped by wartime experience began shifting toward political reliability, and nowhere was this more visible than in parts of the French Navy, where experience occasionally gave way to allegiance. This gradual rebalancing of authority meant that command decisions were not always determined by recent operational merit alone, but also by trust embedded in political continuity. Among those elevated during this period was Hugues du Roy de Chaumareix, an aristocratic naval officer whose future became closely tied to royal restoration. Born into noble society in 1763, Chaumareix had once served in the French Navy before the violence of the French Revolution forced many royalist nobles into exile. Historical accounts indicate that much of his later life unfolded away from meaningful naval command, including years spent outside France, while political turmoil reshaped the country he had left behind. By the time the monarchy returned, decades had passed since he'd handled the practical realities of commanding a major vessel at sea. In maritime terms, such a gap was not merely administrative. It meant separation from evolving navigational practice, shifting discipline standards, and the accumulated experience that only continuous service could provide. Yet in 1816, Chaumareix received command of the Medusa, a 40-gun frigate selected as part of a mission to re-establish French control over Senegal, following agreements reached after the Napoleonic Wars. For many professional naval officers, the appointment caused unease almost immediately. Contemporary criticism and later investigations repeatedly pointed toward a troubling reality. The captain had little recent maritime experience and had spent years removed from modern navigation, evolving naval procedures, and the demands of active command. Although aristocratic standing and royal loyalty had opened doors in restored France, the Atlantic remained indifferent to politics. At sea, authority was constantly tested not by appointment, but by conditions that demanded immediate and accurate response. Questions surrounding Chaumareix's competence did not emerge only after catastrophe struck, because evidence suggests uncertainty existed even before departure. Reports from the expedition later described a commander whose decisions often leaned heavily upon advice from others, particularly civilians and passengers who possessed stronger regional familiarity than he did. One figure sometimes mentioned in accounts of the voyage was an experienced passenger, François Griffon du Bellay, whose knowledge of African waters reportedly gained unusual influence over navigation choices. To seasoned officers, such dependence may have hinted at insecurity in command, though formal hierarchy remained intact and few were positioned to openly challenge authority. Within naval structure, questioning a captain's judgment required extraordinary circumstances, even when doubts circulated quietly among experienced crew members. Far from the royal court where appointments were made, the Medusa itself represented ambition wrapped in fragility. France intended to reclaim colonial administration in Senegal, and aboard the ship travelled not only sailors but soldiers, government officials, scientists, merchants, and families prepared to settle abroad. The expedition departed Rochefort on June 17, 1816, alongside vessels including the Loire, the brig Argus, and the corvette Echo. Seen from the harbour, the mission carried the appearance of national renewal, a symbolic extension of restored French confidence after years of military defeat and political humiliation. Yet such symbolism often masked the operational reality that coordination at sea depended less on intention and more on disciplined execution across multiple moving vessels. Beneath this confidence, however, smaller details began forming a quieter pattern. Historical testimony later suggested that Chaumareys displayed impatience early in the voyage, at times allowing the Medusa to outpace accompanying ships rather than maintain disciplined formation. Navigational decisions increasingly reflected confidence unsupported by experience, while some officers reportedly grew uncomfortable with the speed and course being pursued. At sea, doubt rarely announces itself loudly at first. It lingers in small observations, delayed corrections, uneasy silences, and decisions that seem survivable until distance makes reversal impossible. Meanwhile, the Atlantic stretched outward in deceptive calm, carrying the expedition farther from France and deeper into waters where confidence, discipline and judgment mattered more than titles granted in royal chambers. Even subtle separations between convoy ships carried operational consequences, because once vessels drifted beyond immediate visual range, coordination shifted from certainty to assumption. And somewhere beyond the horizon, impatience had already begun drifting faster than caution. A voyage, already drifting toward disaster. Beyond the fading coastline, the Medusa moved into widening Atlantic waters where routine seemed steady enough to quiet concern, even as distance began swallowing the certainty of land behind it. Days aboard a naval voyage in 1816 often passed through repetition rather than spectacle, marked by watch rotations, shifting weather, meals rationed according to rank, and the slow rhythm of a ship carried farther from familiar shores. To those travelling towards Senegal, including soldiers, colonial officials, settlers, sailors, and scientists, the expedition may have seemed less like a gamble than a continuation of France's attempt to reclaim influence after years of war and political upheaval. Yet open water possessed a quiet habit of concealing consequences, because far from ports and ministries, decisions travelled with a ship long before their results became visible. In the early 19th century, long-distance naval movements still depended heavily on experience, visual estimation, and environmental reading rather than precise instrumentation, meaning that authority at sea was often inseparable from interpretation itself, and interpretation could shift without immediate correction. Days into the expedition, subtle changes in pace and direction began separating one ship from the others in ways that felt insignificant at first glance. Having departed Rochefort on June 17, 1816, the Medusa sailed alongside the frigate Loire, the brig Argus, and the corvette Echo as part of a small convoy bound for the coast of West Africa. Maintaining formation between ships offered practical advantages, reducing isolation and preserving coordination should weather or danger intervene. Yet accounts from the voyage later described a growing distance between the Medusa and her companions. Under Captain Hugues Duroy de Chaumaret, the frigate increasingly pressed ahead, leaving intervals of empty horizon where familiar sails had once remained visible. In convoy sailing practices of the period, such spacing was not merely aesthetic but functional, as ships relied on visual signals, flag communication, and relative positioning to maintain cohesion, and once separation widened beyond sight, coordination became dependent on assumptions rather than direct confirmation. Far ahead of ordinary caution, decisions about course and speed slowly gathered around a captain whose confidence appeared stronger than his recent experience. Later testimony surrounding the disaster suggested Chaumareix often relied upon judgment that alarmed some professional officers, even while showing unusual confidence in navigation despite decades away from meaningful command. During the voyage, he reportedly consulted François Griffon du Bellay, a civilian passenger familiar with parts of the African coast, allowing outside advice to shape navigational thinking in ways that unsettled some aboard. Although formal authority remained firmly with the captain, unease began spreading not through dramatic confrontation, but through smaller moments of hesitation, exchanged glances, and the uncomfortable awareness that certainty and competence did not always travel together. In naval practice of the era, such reliance on supplementary guidance was not unheard of, yet it typically functioned as correction rather than substitution, and the subtle shift in dependency would later appear significant when viewed against the sequence of decisions that followed. Across the decks, life aboard continued with the rhythms expected of a long voyage, though small observations quietly unsettled some of those watching the horizon. Sailors carried out familiar labour while soldiers endured cramped routines. Officials discussed colonial administration, and settlers travelled toward futures they could only imagine in territories many had never seen. The Atlantic itself could appear strangely reassuring, because long stretches of calm weather and open sea rewarded confidence, softening instincts that might otherwise question speed or direction. Yet ships carried moods as much as cargo, and when officers began noticing increasing separation from the convoy or uncertain navigational choices, tension settled quietly into conversation rather than openly challenging command. Even in structured naval environments, hesitation rarely emerged as a formal objection at first. Instead, it accumulated in observation, in delayed responses, and in this silent recalibration of trust between those who navigated and those who depended on navigation. Confidence aboard the frigate hardened into something more difficult to question, as the Medusa pressed onward with increasing independence from the ships around her. Historical accounts suggest Chaumareix grew impatient with slower progress and appeared determined to reach Senegal quickly, a confidence that encouraged the Medusa to move beyond the disciplined caution often expected in unfamiliar waters. Distance from accompanying vessels no longer seemed temporary but habitual, narrowing opportunities for correction while leaving those aboard increasingly dependent on a single command structure. In ordinary circumstances, such confidence might have appeared admirable, even efficient. Yet the farther the frigate travelled, the more difficult it became to reverse the uncertainty. Naval expeditions of the period often balanced ambition with procedural caution, precisely because correction at sea was costly in time and positioning, and once momentum favoured speed over verification, even small navigational errors could compound without immediate visibility. Closer to the western edge of Africa, the sea itself began changing character, though few aboard fully understood how little room uncertainty allowed. The expedition approached waters shaped by currents, shifting sands, and coastal geography that demanded careful navigation, particularly near the dangerous shallows stretching along the Mauritanian coast. By early July, confidence in speed and course carried the Medusa toward a region where experience mattered more than optimism, and where mistakes concealed beneath calm water could wait unnoticed until the moment correction became impossible. Coastal navigation in such regions required constant comparison between estimated position and environmental cues, yet once separation from the convoy reduced external reference points, even experienced mariners depended heavily on judgment under conditions that could not always be verified. Near the coast, they believed they understood, the sea was already becoming shallower than anyone aboard seemed prepared to admit, stranded on the sands of Arguin. What first disturbed the voyage was not violence or noise, but a quiet interruption in movement that left the Medusa lingering above waters few aboard could properly read. After weeks of steady travel, the change may not have appeared alarming at first, because ships crossing uncertain coastlines often slowed or adjusted course according to weather, currents, or navigation. Yet near the western coast of Africa, where shallow banks and shifting sands complicated passage, certainty depended upon judgment as much as confidence, and confidence aboard the Medusa had already been stretched farther than caution. The Atlantic still looked calm from the deck, carrying little outward sign of danger, but something beneath the surface had begun resisting movement in a way that no horizon could explain. In coastal navigation of the early 19th century, This region was particularly known among mariners for its deceptive appearance, where depth could change without visual warning, and where charts often lagged behind the shifting realities of sandbanks shaped by seasonal currents. Morning light on July 2nd revealed an unsettling reality as the frigate failed to move with the confidence expected of a vessel crossing open sea. On July 2nd, 1816, the Medusa ran aground on the Bank of Arguin, a dangerous region of shallow sandbanks off the coast of present-day Mauritania, long known to sailors for treacherous navigation. Later testimony and historical accounts suggest the grounding did not arrive as a sudden scene of splintering destruction or crashing panic, but as something more confusing and in many ways more unsettling: immobility. The frigate had struck sand and become lodged where open water had been expected, leaving officers and passengers confronting a problem difficult to fully understand in the moment. From the deck, the sea remained visible in every direction, the sky unchanged, the expedition outwardly intact, yet movement, the quiet certainty that had carried them across the Atlantic, had disappeared. In such conditions, the absence of motion often produced more confusion than immediate disaster, because without visible damage or collapse, the ship still appeared structurally whole, even as its fundamental function had been compromised. Efforts to restore certainty soon gathered around practical tasks, as officers and crew worked under the assumption that patience and labour might still reverse what had happened. At first, many believed the Medusa could simply be freed, particularly because the ship had not broken apart and remained standing above water. Attempts were organised to lighten the vessel, with heavy cargo, supplies and equipment removed in hopes of reducing the weight enough to release the hull from sand. Sailors worked through difficult conditions while commanders discussed tides, currents and timing, searching for moments when changing water levels might assist escape. For a brief period, effort itself offered reassurance, because practical labour allowed uncertainty to feel temporary rather than permanent. Maritime practice of the era often treated grounding as reversible if addressed quickly, and that assumption shaped early decisions, even as the physical resistance of the sandbank gradually undermined optimism. Isolation pressed more heavily upon the expedition once the geography around them became impossible to ignore, because the Bank of Arguin offered neither safe passage nor immediate rescue. Stretching across hazardous shallows near the Mauritanian coast, the region had earned a dangerous reputation among mariners precisely because navigation mistakes became difficult to recover from once committed. In calmer waters farther from shore, a convoy might remain within reach, or assistance arrive before danger deepened, but the Medusa had gradually separated from accompanying ships during the voyage, leaving distance where coordination had once existed. The Loire, Argus and Echo were no longer near enough to immediately intervene, and the consequences of earlier impatience quietly returned in the form of absence. What had seemed like confidence while crossing the open ocean now narrowed the expedition's options beneath an unforgiving sun and across unfamiliar waters. Communication at sea in this period depended entirely on visual proximity, meaning that once ships were separated beyond horizon range, even urgent signalling became impossible, leaving stranded vessels to rely on expectation rather than confirmation of assistance. Conversations once softened by routine gradually turned uneasy as stranded passengers, soldiers, and sailors confronted the possibility that waiting alone would solve very little. The Medusa carried a complicated human mixture of military personnel, officials appointed to Senegal, colonists seeking opportunity, crew members trained for maritime hardship, and civilians with little experience of prolonged danger at sea. Daily rhythms that had once provided order began changing shape as speculation spread between decks, because uncertainty rarely remained confined to officers alone. Some reportedly questioned navigational decisions, while others looked toward tides or weather for reassurance that never fully arrived. Time itself began to feel altered aboard the stranded ship, measured less by distance travelled and more by repeated failed efforts, shrinking patience, and the growing realization that confidence alone could not move timber trapped in sand. Even routine signals of naval discipline, orders, watches, and structured labour began to lose their stabilizing effect when repeated effort failed to produce visible change. Little by little, attention shifted away from saving the ship toward a harder question involving survival, numbers, and how many people the expedition could realistically move. Attempts to free the Medusa failed to deliver the result many had hoped for, and worsening weather complicated optimism that the vessel might safely remain stranded until help appeared. Officers increasingly faced uncomfortable calculations about lifeboat capacity, provisions, and responsibility, because the expedition carried far more people than existing boats could transport at once. Practical discussion began replacing denial, and with it emerged ideas that revealed how unprepared the mission truly was for disaster. If the Medusa could not sail again, decisions would have to be made about who left, how they left, and what kind of compromise desperation was willing to accept. The presence of limited lifeboats, originally intended for evacuation contingencies rather than mass transport, became central to these calculations, exposing a structural mismatch between expectation and reality. Before long, plans were taking shape around overcrowded boats, and a solution so uncertain that few could have mistaken it for safety. The day 147 people were sent onto a raft. Measured conversations gradually replaced hope, as officers and officials aboard the stranded Medusa turned from failed rescue attempts toward decisions no one had expected to make so quickly. Days of uncertainty on the bank of Arguin had steadily narrowed what once seemed temporary into something harder to deny, because repeated attempts to free the frigate failed to restore movement, and worsening conditions reduced confidence that waiting alone would solve anything. Beneath the practical language of command, a quieter pressure began settling over the expedition, shaped by numbers, provisions, weather, and the growing realization that the ship itself could no longer be trusted to carry everyone safely forward. The sea surrounding the Medusa remained deceptively wide and calm, yet aboard the stranded vessel, conversation shifted towards something colder than hope, as survival slowly became a matter of calculation. In naval decision-making of the period, such transitions from repair to evacuation were rarely formalized in advance, meaning that necessity often arrived before doctrine could fully define it. Arithmetic soon became impossible to ignore once the expedition confronted how few boats remained available for so many people waiting to leave the stranded frigate. Historical accounts place more than 400 people aboard the Medusa during the voyage, including officers, sailors, soldiers, colonial officials, passengers, and settlers travelling towards Senegal, while the available lifeboats offered nowhere near enough room to evacuate everyone at once. Under ordinary circumstances, such vessels served short transport purposes rather than mass escape, and the realities of overcrowding became increasingly difficult to overlook as officers discussed possible arrangements. Questions of weight, balance, supplies, and distance moved beside larger fears few openly wished to voice, because practical planning quietly revealed an uncomfortable truth. Survival would not be distributed evenly. Maritime capacity planning at the time was constrained not only by physical limitations, but also by the assumption that ships would not require total evacuation, far from coordinated support, an assumption now silently collapsing under the reality of the situation. Built more from necessity than confidence, an improvised platform slowly emerged as a solution practical enough to discuss and unsettling enough to distrust. Using timber and materials available from the Medusa, crew members constructed what later accounts described as a large raft, measuring roughly 20 metres long and 7 metres wide, a broad but unstable structure never intended to function as a secure passenger vessel. The raft appears to have first been imagined as a logistical supplement, something capable of helping carry people or cargo while lifeboats moved alongside, yet even before departure, its limitations would have been difficult to ignore. It sat low in the water, lacked proper manoeuvrability, and offered little protection from waves or weather, while its sheer instability raised difficult questions about how so many people might remain standing, resting, or even balanced upon it for long. Practical desperation gave the raft purpose, but purpose alone could not disguise fragility. Its construction reflected the improvisational nature of crisis response at sea, where available materials and immediate urgency often replaced engineering standards designed for safety or endurance. Rank and responsibility quietly shaped expectations, as discussions over evacuation revealed who might travel with relative security and who would be asked to accept uncertainty. Historical testimony following the disaster repeatedly suggested that officers, senior officials, and individuals holding greater authority or social standing occupied places aboard the boats judged safer, while many soldiers, sailors, labourers, and lower-ranking passengers found themselves increasingly associated with the raft. Though precise assignments shifted amid confusion, the structure of decision-making reflected social hierarchy, familiar to 19th century naval life, where rank often influenced access, responsibility, and survival itself. Few aboard likely viewed the arrangement as openly cruel in the moment, because desperation often disguises inequality as practicality, yet the imbalance lingered in quiet observations. Who received seats, who waited, and who gradually understood that confidence in rescue would depend on conditions others had chosen for them. In such environments, hierarchy did not disappear under pressure. It often reorganized itself into new forms that still echoed its original structure. Morning preparations on July 5th transformed hesitation into movement, while soldiers, sailors, officials, and civilians crowded toward escape plans few fully understood. Boats were lowered, supplies gathered, and confusion spread through activity rather than panic, as people attempted to interpret instructions amid growing uncertainty. The stranded Medusa had become increasingly vulnerable to worsening weather and structural instability, leaving little room for delay, even if no plan inspired confidence. Historical estimates later associated approximately 147 people with the raft, including soldiers and sailors, placed upon a structure crowded beyond anything resembling safety, while boats prepared to tow it toward land or rescue. In the language of planning, the arrangement may have sounded temporary, practical, even survivable, yet appearances aboard told a more uneasy story, because overcrowding and instability were already visible before the expedition moved at all. What made the situation particularly precarious was not only the number of people involved, but also the absence of any tested precedent for coordinating such an uneven distribution of weight and control between multiple small craft and a single improvised platform in open ocean conditions. Uneasy confidence settled over the evacuation once overloaded boats, and an unstable wooden structure began depending upon one another to move across open water. The raft floated low beneath the weight forced upon it, crowded with men standing shoulder to shoulder, exposed to sun, sea, and uncertainty before the voyage had properly resumed. Boats positioned nearby carried officers, officials, supplies, and others expected to guide evacuation efforts, while tow lines connected the fragile structure to vessels tasked with leading it away from danger. Survival, for the moment, rested not on strength or navigation alone, but on fragile cooperation between improvised decisions and uneasy trust, because those aboard the raft possessed little control over what came next except faith that movement itself still meant escape. Even the act of towing, which might have suggested coordination, depended on maintaining consistent spacing, tension, and direction across shifting water conditions that offered no guarantee of stability. For those watching the strained lines stretch between drifting bodies of wood and overloaded boats, trust had already begun carrying more weight than certainty. The moment the lifeboats let go. Unsteady movement along the tow lines marked the beginning of a voyage no one on the raft could fully interpret as anything other than an uncertain continuation. What had begun as an arranged evacuation from the stranded Medusa now moved across the open Atlantic in a formation that already felt strained, with lifeboats pulling ahead, while a massive overloaded raft followed behind on ropes that tightened and loosened with every shift in wave and wind. The sea around the bank of Arguin offered no reassuring landmarks, only repeating stretches of water and horizon that made distance difficult to judge, and in that lack of reference, even small changes in spacing between boats and rafts carried a growing psychological weight. For those standing shoulder to shoulder on the wooden platform, the sense of being transported and the sense of being abandoned began to blur in ways that no one could yet fully name. In naval practice of the period, towing arrangements depended heavily on maintaining consistent tension across ropes, yet such precision was difficult to sustain when multiple vessels reacted differently to swell patterns, wind shifts, and load distribution. Jolting waves and unstable weight distribution quickly exposed how fragile the arrangement had become once the raft began pulling against the open Atlantic. Historical accounts describe a structure overcrowded with approximately 147 people, built hastily from available timber, never intended to carry human weight across open water, and now responding to every swell with violent instability that forced men to brace themselves constantly to avoid being thrown into the sea. Water repeatedly washed across the surface, soaking supplies and adding to the difficulty of maintaining balance, while the sheer density of bodies left little space for movement or adjustment. Even the act of remaining upright became an ongoing effort rather than a simple posture, and the ocean, indifferent to the improvisation above it, continued to test every weakness in the design. The physical strain of shared weight meant that movement in one section of the raft inevitably affected stability elsewhere, creating a constant chain reaction of shifting balance that left no position entirely secure. Distant positioning of the escorting boats soon created confusion aboard the raft, as visibility and communication deteriorated beyond reliable interpretation. In the early phase of the evacuation, boats were intended to guide and tow the raft towards Senegal, maintaining coordinated movement across coastal waters, but the distance between vessels began to grow in ways that were difficult to explain from the perspective of those on the raft. Shouts carried poorly over wind and water, and signals that might once have been understood clearly became fragmented impressions of motion and direction. Whether due to shifting conditions, miscommunication, or structural strain within the convoy itself, the relationship between the raft and boats became increasingly difficult to read, leaving those aboard the raft dependent on interpretations rather than certainty. Maritime signalling in this era relied on line-of-sight communication, meaning that once spray, distance, or curvature of the horizon intervened, even deliberate instructions could dissolve into ambiguity. Gradually shifting perception among those on the raft turned hope into alarm as familiar reference points in the convoy began to disappear from view. Boats that had once been close enough to see in detail became smaller shapes against a widening horizon, and the expectation that they would remain within supportive distance weakened as time passed without clear reassurance. On the raft itself, the crowded arrangement limited movement and conversation, compressing hundreds of individuals into a single unstable platform where every reaction was shared and amplified by proximity. In such conditions, uncertainty did not remain private. It spread quickly through observation, silence, and the recognition that control over direction, speed, and outcome no longer rested with those aboard the raft. Even subtle changes in spacing between vessels were interpreted collectively, turning small visual shifts into shared emotional signals that could not be independently verified. Disorder spread through the crowded platform once the realization took hold that coordination between raft and boats was no longer functioning as intended. Historical accounts and survivor testimonies differ in precise detail regarding the moment tow lines were cut or lost, but they converge on a shared sense of separation occurring during the early phase of the voyage after departure from the Bank of Arguin. What matters most in those descriptions is not the exact mechanism alone, but the immediate effect of disconnection as the raft ceased to move in disciplined relation to the escorting boats and began responding directly to currents and wind without guidance. In that shift, the illusion of controlled evacuation gave way to a more unsettling reality. Movement continued, but purpose and direction had fractured. Once separated, the raft no longer benefited from corrective navigation inputs, meaning its trajectory became entirely dependent on environmental forces rather than coordinated intent. Cold water and widening separation from the convoy left the raft exposed to a silence that felt heavier than the movement of the sea itself. As the boats pulled farther away, whether by intent, necessity, or miscalculation, the raft was left increasingly alone on open water, carrying far more people than any stable vessel could reasonably support. The absence of close escort removed not only physical support but also the psychological structure that had made survival feel coordinated, replacing it with a vast openness in which direction could no longer be confirmed by sight or sound. What remained was motion without clarity, bodies without protection from the elements, and an ocean that offered no indication that it would alter its course for human fear. Even the expectation of eventual correction, once anchored in the idea of convoy cohesion, ceased to function as a reliable assumption. With nothing left clearly tethering them to direction or certainty, the drifting began to feel like something that could no longer be corrected. The first nights on a floating nightmare. Suspended isolation on the Atlantic began to feel less like movement and more like exposure once the raft was left entirely without the escorting ships that had once defined its direction. What had started as an organised evacuation from the stranded Medusa had now become an open and unprotected passage across waters that offered no shelter, no landmarks, and no reassurance that anything beyond the horizon remained aligned with expectation. The raft itself, overloaded and unstable, carried its human mass across a surface that seemed indifferent, to whether it survived the journey at all, while the absence of nearby vessels removed the last visible structure of coordination that had once made the situation feel temporary. In that widening emptiness, even silence changed meaning, because without guidance or proximity, every movement of water felt like uncertainty made physical. Fractured coordination among the crowded survivors emerged almost immediately as the absence of structured command left decisions scattered across voices struggling to be heard over the sea. On the Medusa itself, hierarchy and order had still offered a framework for action, but aboard the Raft, where approximately 147 people were confined to a hastily constructed wooden platform, the practical limits of space and stability prevented any consistent authority from taking shape. Instructions were shouted, repeated, lost in the wind, or swallowed by the rhythm of waves, and attempts to maintain direction depended more on interpretation than control. In conditions where every shift of weight affected balance, even simple disagreements carried consequences that extended beyond argument, because collective survival required coordination that was already beginning to dissolve. Parched throats and salt-heavy air soon introduced a physical strain that no earlier stage of the voyage had prepared those aboard for in any meaningful way. Fresh water supplies, limited from the beginning, became increasingly insufficient as exposure to sun, salt spray, and exertion accelerated dehydration among those packed tightly together on the raft. Historical accounts of the disaster consistently emphasized the severity of thirst during the earliest days, describing how basic physical needs quickly overtook broader concerns about navigation or rescue. The surrounding ocean, vast and visibly abundant, offered no relief, reinforcing a contradiction that deepened psychological strain, surrounded by water, yet unable to survive from it. As time passed, endurance became less about endurance of motion, and more about endurance of deprivation itself. Pressure within the tightly packed platform gradually transformed discomfort into conflict, as limited space and failing resources began shaping increasingly desperate behaviour. Movement was restricted not only by the raft's size, but by the density of bodies, occupying every available surface, leaving little opportunity for rest or separation. In such conditions, minor disputes could escalate quickly because the absence of space removed any buffer between frustration and action. Reports from survivors later described tensions arising over positioning, access to remaining provisions, and the constant struggle to maintain balance during shifting waves. What might have been tolerable under ordinary circumstances became intensified under continuous exposure, where exhaustion reduced patience and fear amplified reaction. Relentless waves striking the raft through the night reinforced a growing awareness that the ocean was no longer surrounding them, but actively invading every attempt at stability. Water repeatedly washed across the platform, soaking clothing, supplies, and already weakened provisions, while the structure itself responded unpredictably to every swell. Without protective sides or proper design for open sea travel, the raft offered no barrier between its occupants and the Atlantic, turning each wave into a physical interruption of whatever fragile order remained. As night approached, visibility diminished, making it harder to anticipate movement or adjust positioning, and the absence of stable reference points contributed to a sense that the raft was no longer travelling through the sea, but being repeatedly tested by it. Diminished light across the open water marked the arrival of night as a condition rather than a time, where visibility, certainty, and calm all began dissolving together. Darkness on the Atlantic did not simply remove sight, it removed orientation, leaving only sound, movement, and the uncertain presence of others pressed close in the confined space of the raft. In the absence of visual continuity, every shift of weight or sudden motion carried heightened significance, because it could no longer be immediately interpreted or contextualized. The sea, now largely invisible, continued its motion regardless of human perception, and the raft moved within it without a clear understanding of direction or distance. What remained was not rest, but sustained awareness under conditions that made rest increasingly difficult to distinguish from vulnerability. In the absence of clear direction or rest, every passing hour began to feel like something the body could no longer interpret safely. Hunger, delirium, and the edge of humanity. Persistent exhaustion carried over from the first nights began shaping every waking moment on the raft into a continuation of survival rather than a reset of it. Sleep, when it came at all, was fragmented by instability, overcrowding, and the constant movement of the sea beneath a structure never designed to carry so many lives in such conditions. What had begun as a desperate attempt to remain afloat after separation from the Medusa had now turned into a prolonged state of endurance, where time no longer offered recovery but only repetition. The Atlantic remained unchanged in its vastness, yet for those on the raft, perception of that vastness narrowed into immediate physical strain, where each hour demanded effort simply to remain present. Dehydration deepened into a constant physiological strain that steadily reduced clarity of thought among those already weakened by days without adequate relief. Fresh water, limited from the beginning of the evacuation, diminished rapidly under exposure to sun, salt spray and physical exhaustion, leaving those aboard increasingly dependent on conditions that could not sustain them. Historical accounts of the Méduse disaster consistently emphasize thirst as one of the earliest and most severe pressures, shaping not only physical suffering but also decision-making and awareness. The body's response to prolonged dehydration was not immediate collapse but gradual impairment, where speech, coordination, and focus weakened in parallel, creating a condition in which even simple communication required effort that many could no longer consistently maintain. Scarcity of food supplies gradually altered behaviour aboard the raft as attention increasingly centred on limited provisions rather than any expectation of rescue. Provisions that had been carried onto the raft during its hurried construction were insufficient for sustained survival, and rationing quickly became more symbolic than functional as days passed without replenishment. Under normal conditions, shared hardship might reinforce cooperation, but under prolonged deprivation, focus often shifts toward immediate physical needs, narrowing attention to whatever remains accessible in the moment. In such an environment, the concept of distribution itself becomes unstable, because fairness depends on order, and order weakens as exhaustion intensifies. What began as rationing slowly transformed into observation, calculation, and quiet competition over diminishing resources. Disoriented perception began to surface among the most weakened survivors as fatigue and exposure distorted the sense of time and immediate surroundings. Extended deprivation of water, food, and restorative rest produces effects that are physical as well as cognitive, and historical narratives from the disaster describe individuals struggling to maintain coherent awareness of time's passage or spatial orientation on the raft. Days and nights ceased to be clearly distinct experiences, blending into cycles of heat, cold, movement, and exhaustion that lacked stable markers of progression. In such conditions, perception itself becomes unreliable, not through sudden collapse but through incremental degradation, where the ability to interpret the environment weakens in step with physical endurance. The sea, constant and unchanging, provided no reference for recalibration, leaving only internal instability to define experience. Deteriorating cooperation replaced earlier attempts at order. Once shared survival pressure began overriding discipline, hierarchy, and restraint. The raft, already strained by overcrowding and instability, offered no structural support for sustained authority, and the absence of effective oversight allowed social boundaries to weaken under continuous stress. Historical accounts suggest that initial efforts at coordination gave way to fragmented interactions, where decisions were shaped more by immediate necessity than by any agreed system of governance. In such circumstances, survival does not eliminate social structure instantly, but erodes it unevenly, with some attempting to preserve order, while others prioritize immediate physical survival. The resulting tension does not always manifest as open conflict at first, but as gradual divergence in behavior, intent, and tolerance. Fading responsiveness among the crowded survivors marked a turning point where exhaustion no longer appeared temporary but structural to their condition. Physical depletion reached a stage where movement required increasing effort, and even basic reactions became slower and less reliable, altering the rhythm of life on the raft in ways that compounded existing instability. The environment offered no relief from this progression, as exposure to sun, salt, and motion continued without interruption, reinforcing the sense that decline was not episodic but continuous. Within this context, survival shifted from active resistance toward passive endurance, where maintaining presence itself became the primary struggle. The raft, still moving across open water, now carried not only bodies but diminishing capacity for coordination or sustained awareness. With fewer voices able to coordinate and fewer bodies able to endure, the raft's silence began to feel like something actively consuming what remained of its occupants. 15 men left in an empty sea. After so many days of attrition at sea, what remained aboard the raft had been reduced to a condition where survival itself appeared thinner than the silence surrounding it. The Atlantic, unchanged in its scale and indifference, continued to stretch in every direction without offering interruption, while the small number of bodies still capable of movement clung to a structure that had long ceased to resemble anything functional beyond the fact of floating. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since the initial grounding and the forced evacuation from the Medusa, and in that interval, what had once been a large and crowded evacuation had contracted into something almost unrecognisable, shaped less by planning than by exhaustion, deprivation, and the simple inability of the human body to sustain itself indefinitely under such conditions. The raft no longer carried the sense of organised passage, it carried only persistence against disappearance. Measured passage of time had nearly dissolved into uncertainty by the point where counting days no longer aligned with the experience of those still conscious on the water. Historical accounts of the Méduse disaster describe survivors losing a clear distinction between night and day, as exhaustion, dehydration, and continuous exposure disrupted normal perception, leaving time fragmented into intervals of discomfort, brief awareness, and prolonged unconsciousness. Without stable markers such as shorelines, clocks, or structured routine, even the idea of duration became unreliable, replaced by a more immediate awareness of suffering and the changing intensity of physical condition. In such an environment, time did not feel like progression, but like repetition, each moment indistinguishable from the last except in the degree of strain it imposed on those still alive. Reduced numbers of survivors became impossible to ignore as exhaustion and deprivation had already removed most of what once constituted a crowded human presence. Estimates vary in historical sources, but only a fraction of those originally placed on the raft remained alive after the extended drift, leaving behind a dramatically diminished group whose survival was no longer defined by strength alone but by endurance beyond expectation. The scale of reduction itself altered the atmosphere aboard, because absence is not neutral in such conditions. It becomes a constant reminder of what has already failed. Where once there had been noise, movement, and conflict among many bodies, there was now only the intermittent presence of a few, their reduced capacity for interaction mirroring the broader depletion of energy and will. Endless stretches of open Atlantic surrounded what was left of the raft with a stillness that offered no indication of direction, distance, or change. The sea had long ceased to provide any meaningful reference for navigation or orientation, instead functioning as an unbroken field in which the survivors existed without landmarks or measurable progress. Wind, light, and wave patterns continued in natural rhythm, but to those aboard, such patterns no longer carried interpretive value. They simply existed, indifferent to the condition of human life upon them. The absence of nearby vessels reinforced this sense of isolation, not through sudden disappearance, but through prolonged continuity of emptiness, where nothing approached and nothing departed, and the horizon remained structurally unchanged. Unexpected interruption of isolation emerged when a distant shape on the horizon began to suggest the possibility of contact after an extended absence of any vessel. After prolonged periods without sighting another ship, the appearance of a faint outline against the sea introduced a moment of uncertainty in which perception itself had to be tested against hope. Historical accounts identify the French naval ship Argus as the vessel that eventually encountered survivors of the raft, though from a distance it would have first appeared as little more than a shifting mark within the haze of ocean light. For those still capable of awareness, the difficulty lay not only in recognizing what was seen, but in determining whether recognition itself could still be trusted after so much time without external reference. Delayed recognition between those adrift and the approaching ship created a moment suspended between certainty and disbelief that neither side could immediately resolve. From the raft, the approaching vessel existed first as a possibility rather than a confirmation, while from the ship, the presence of survivors required gradual understanding as distance closed, and the scale of what had been encountered became visible. This interval between sighting and acknowledgement carried its own tension, shaped by the accumulation of days without rescue and the fragility of perception among those who had endured extreme deprivation. Even as communication began to form across the water, it remained uncertain how quickly meaning could be restored between two realities, separated not only by distance, but by the conditions of survival itself. Even as rescue finally took shape across the water, the condition of those who had endured it had already rewritten what survival could still mean. The scandal, France could not hide. Re-entry into public awareness began only after the survivors were no longer bound to the sea, allowing their experiences aboard the raft to surface as written and spoken accounts. What had unfolded on the Atlantic during the summer of 1816 remained for a time confined to those who endured it directly, but the return to land marked a shift like the disaster itself, because survival did not end the story, it transformed it into testimony. The Méduse had already disappeared from the ocean's immediate horizon, yet its consequences began expanding into another domain entirely, where memory, documentation, and interpretation replaced wind, water, and distance. In this new setting, the event no longer belonged to the sea alone. It entered public record, where it could be examined, questioned, and reshaped by those who had not witnessed it firsthand. In the early 19th century, such transitions from maritime incident to public discourse were shaped heavily by printed media, official correspondence, and the slow circulation of first-hand narratives through administrative and publishing networks. Recorded testimonies soon started circulating in France as detailed narratives from survivors of the Méduse disaster reached publishers and officials alike. Among the most significant were the accounts associated with Alexandre Correard, an engineer, and Jean-Baptiste Henri Savigny, a surgeon, whose published narrative of the shipwreck and raft ordeal provided one of the earliest structured descriptions of what occurred after the Medusa ran aground. Their testimony described not only the physical ordeal of the raft, but also the breakdown of order, the abandonment at sea, and the conditions under which survival became increasingly untenable. These accounts were not presented as abstract commentary, but as direct recollections shaped by extreme experience, and their publication ensured that the disaster could no longer remain confined to fragmented reports or official summaries alone. Printed narratives of this kind carried particular authority in post-Napoleonic France, where eyewitness testimony often held significant weight in shaping public understanding of state actions at a distance. Widespread reaction within French society emerged gradually as accounts of abandonment and survival reached audiences unaccustomed to the scale of maritime catastrophe being described. In the early 19th century, France was still navigating political and institutional reorganization following years of revolution and imperial conflict, and the Méduse disaster struck a sensitive intersection between public expectation and naval authority. The idea that a state expedition carrying officials, soldiers, and settlers could end in such conditions of apparent mismanagement challenged assumptions about competence and responsibility within the restored monarchy's institutions. As details spread through printed narratives and discussion, the story of the raft began to take on a symbolic weight that extended beyond the event itself, becoming a focal point for broader questions about authority and failure. In salons, pamphlets, and early press commentary, the disaster was increasingly treated not only as an isolated maritime incident, but as an example of systemic breakdown. Institutional attention quickly followed public concern as naval authorities and government officials began examining the implications of what survivors were asserting. The emergence of detailed testimony placed pressure on official channels to account for decisions made during the expedition, particularly regarding command structure, navigation, and the circumstances that led to the grounding on the Bank of Arguin and the subsequent evacuation. In such cases, institutional response often involves both investigation and narrative management, as authorities attempt to reconcile public perception with administrative records. The Méduse incident, therefore, did not remain solely a matter of maritime inquiry. It became a question of accountability within a system still defining its post-revolutionary identity. Bureaucratic correspondence and internal review processes began to function not only as investigative tools, but also as mechanisms for controlling how the event would be formally remembered. Conflicting narratives between official reports and survivor descriptions soon revealed sharp disparities in how responsibility for the disaster was being represented. While official accounts tended to emphasize navigational error, environmental conditions, or procedural complications, survivor testimonies placed greater weight on leadership decisions, abandonment, and the breakdown of coordinated evacuation. These differences did not merely reflect variation in perspective, but exposed a deeper tension between institutional explanation and lived experience. As both versions circulated, the disaster acquired a dual identity, one contained within formal reporting and another shaped by first-hand survival under extreme conditions. The space between these interpretations became increasingly difficult to ignore, as each version influenced how the event was understood by the public. Over time, this divergence contributed to a broader debate about whether maritime disasters should be judged primarily through technical causation or human accountability. Escalating scrutiny shifted the focus of discussion from the events at sea toward the credibility of those who had been in command during the voyage. As attention concentrated on decision-making, prior service records, appointments, and the circumstances surrounding command assignment became subjects of renewed examination, particularly in relation to Captain Hugues de Roy de Chaumareix and the broader structure of naval authority involved in the expedition. The disaster was no longer being discussed solely as an isolated maritime failure, but as a chain of choices embedded within institutional processes. In this environment, the question of responsibility extended beyond a single moment or individual, instead unfolding across a network of decisions that had shaped the expedition from its beginning. Administrative scrutiny increasingly intersected with public perception, reinforcing the sense that the Méduse disaster was not simply an accident of sea and weather, but a failure embedded in systems of appointment and oversight. As competing versions of what happened continued to surface, the boundaries between truth, responsibility, and silence began to fracture beyond containment. The painting built from a shipwreck. In the aftermath of public outrage surrounding the Méduse disaster, attention gradually shifted from political accusation toward the question of how such an event could be understood in any lasting form. The scandal had already moved through France's naval and political institutions, but its persistence in public discourse created a different kind of pressure, one that could not be resolved through inquiry alone. Written testimonies by survivors such as Alexandre Correard and Jean-Baptiste Henri Savigny had established a factual and emotional record of what occurred, yet even these accounts carried the limitations of language when faced with conditions that had pushed human endurance to its edge. As the debate continued, the disaster began to occupy a space beyond journalism or official report, entering a cultural terrain where memory, representation, and interpretation became inseparable from the event itself. In this transition, the Méduse ceased to exist solely as a maritime incident, and instead became a problem of how catastrophe could be rendered visible to those who had not experienced it. Amid this period of cultural and historical reckoning, Théodore Géricault began turning his focus toward the shipwreck as a subject that demanded more than written testimony alone. Working in early 19th century Paris, he encountered the Méduse narrative not as distant news but as an unresolved rupture in public consciousness, one that had not settled into closure despite official attempts to frame it. His decision to engage with the subject reflected an artistic interest in extreme human conditions, but also a broader cultural moment in which the boundaries between history and representation were being actively tested. The shipwreck, still vivid in public memory, offered a subject that resisted simplification, and it was precisely this resistance that drew him toward it. Within the emerging Romantic movement, artists increasingly sought subjects that conveyed intensity, instability, and the limits of human control, placing Géricault's interest within a wider shift away from classical idealization. Through conversations with survivors and careful examination of published accounts, Géricault assembled fragmented descriptions of the raft, the sea conditions, and the human struggle that unfolded upon it. He studied the narratives not as linear stories, but as pieces of experience that could be reconfigured into visual form, aware that no single testimony could contain the totality of what had occurred. Correard and Savigny's account, widely circulated after publication, provided structural detail about the construction of the raft, the conditions aboard, and the eventual reduction in survivors. But even these descriptions pointed toward the limits of comprehension when confronted with sustained deprivation and chaos at sea. In seeking to translate such accounts into imagery, Géricault was not simply illustrating a story, he was attempting to reconstruct a reality that had already exceeded conventional depiction. He reportedly treated the studio almost like an investigative space, where fragments of testimony were tested against physical observation and anatomical study rather than treated as an abstract narrative. Layer by layer, His studio work developed through studies of anatomy, movement, and composition, as he attempted to reconstruct a scene that no observer had ever been able to fully witness. Historical records of his process describe an intense focus on physical accuracy, including studies of human form under strain, observation of cadavers for anatomical precision, and compositional experiments that gradually shaped the final arrangement of figures on a vast canvas. The painting did not emerge as a single conceptual vision, but as an accumulation of investigations into how bodies behave under extreme conditions, how light interacts with exhaustion, and how spatial arrangement can convey both disorder and direction within a single frame. Each stage of development brought the work closer to a structure capable of holding both documentation and emotional weight. Even the decision to scale the canvas to monumental proportions reflected an intention to force viewers into confrontation rather than observation at a safe distance. When the completed painting was eventually revealed to the public, its scale and unflinching depiction of survival and despair produced reactions that ranged from shock to uneasy recognition. Known formally as the Raft of the Medusa, the work presented viewers with a scene that resisted decorative interpretation, confronting them instead with the aftermath of catastrophe rendered in human terms. Contemporary responses noted its departure from idealized historical painting as it replaced heroic resolution with uncertainty, suffering, and a fragile moment of attention toward distant rescue. The painting did not offer narrative closure. Instead, it held viewers in a suspended moment where survival and loss coexisted without resolution, forcing reflection on the events that had inspired it. In the Parisian exhibition culture of the period, such a presentation stood apart from conventional expectations of historical grandeur, drawing attention precisely because it refused to resolve its subject into triumph or moral clarity. Over time, the image ceased to function as a depiction of a single historical incident and instead became a permanent visual reference through which the disaster was continually reinterpreted. As it entered museums, reproductions, and academic study, the painting transformed the Méduse shipwreck from a contested historical event into an enduring cultural symbol, shaping how later generations would encounter the story. In this transformation, the boundary between event and representation became increasingly difficult to separate as the painting's imagery began to stand in for the historical reality it depicted. What had once been experienced only by those aboard the raft was now mediated through a single composition that condensed suffering, survival, and aftermath into a lasting visual form. Its influence extended beyond art history into broader discussions of how collective memory is constructed through selective visibility. From that moment forward, the memory of the Méduse no longer existed only in accounts of what happened, but in a scene that would never stop being seen. Why the raft still haunts history, still embedded in historical discourse 2 centuries later, the Méduse disaster persists as an unresolved reference point that refuses to settle into a single, definitive interpretation. What began as a maritime catastrophe in 1816 off the coast of West Africa has long since expanded beyond the circumstances of its origin, continuing to surface in historical writing, ethical debate, and cultural reflection as a case that resists final containment. Even in its most documented form, through survivor accounts, naval records, and later artistic reconstruction, the event maintains a kind of interpretive instability, where each retelling introduces emphasis, omission, or framing that shifts how it is understood. Rather than diminishing with time, the Méduse appears to accumulate layers of meaning, each generation encountering not a resolved history, but a continuing problem of interpretation. Questions of command responsibility and political appointment repeatedly resurface in scholarly analysis, particularly when examining how authority was structured aboard the expedition before it ever reached open water. The appointment of Hugues du Roy de Chaumareix, a royalist figure who had been long removed from active maritime command before taking control of the frigate, remains central to discussions of how political restoration intersected with operational readiness in the early 19th century French Navy. Historians often return to the broader institutional context in which naval positions were influenced not only by experience, but also by shifting political loyalties following the Napoleonic era. Within this framework, the Méduse becomes more than an isolated failure of seamanship. It becomes an example of how authority structures themselves can carry latent consequences that only become visible under crisis conditions. Revisiting the raft's internal structure exposes how survival was shaped not only by chance, but by deeply embedded hierarchies that mirrored the rigid social order of the period. The evacuation from the Medusa placed officers, soldiers, and civilians together in an improvised structure never intended to sustain human life at sea, yet even in that condition, distinctions of rank and authority did not immediately disappear. Historical accounts and survivor testimonies indicate that decision-making, access to resources, and spatial arrangement on the raft reflected pre-existing hierarchies, which continued to influence behaviour even as material conditions deteriorated. This persistence of structure under collapse has made the Méduse a recurring subject in discussions of how social systems behave under extreme stress, where formal order weakens but does not vanish instantly. Examined through the lens of human endurance studies, the documented behaviours of survivors continue to challenge simplified interpretations of morality under extreme deprivation. Accounts from Alexandre Correard and Jean-Baptiste Henri Savigny, among others, describe conditions in which thirst, hunger, exhaustion, and exposure progressively altered perception and decision-making over time, creating a situation where survival was no longer governed by normal expectations of conduct. Modern analysis of such conditions often avoids assigning moral certainty to actions taken under extreme constraint, instead focusing on how environmental pressure reshapes cognition and behaviour. In the case of the Méduse, this has led to continued discussion not only of what occurred, but of how such circumstances should be understood when ordinary frameworks of judgment no longer fully apply. Culturally, Géricault's visual reconstruction ensured that the Méduse would never remain confined to maritime history alone, but would enter a permanent space of artistic and collective memory. His painting, The Raft of the Medusa, transformed the disaster into a structured image that has continued to circulate in museums, education, and visual culture as one of the defining representations of human suffering at sea. The work's composition, scale, and refusal to resolve its central scene into clear salvation or closure contributed to its lasting impact, embedding the event within a visual form that continues to shape how it is encountered. As a result, the Méduse exists not only as a historical record but also as a mediated image, where interpretation is influenced as much by visual memory as by textual documentation. Despite extensive historical inquiry and artistic representation, the Méduse remains an event that resists closure, as each analysis seems to reopen the conditions that produced it. Attempts to fully stabilise its meaning encounter the same structural difficulty. The convergence of political decision, maritime failure, human endurance, and cultural reinterpretation cannot be reduced to a single explanatory thread without leaving essential tensions unresolved. This persistence is part of what keeps the disaster active within historical discourse, not as an unresolved mystery in the sensational sense, but as a complex case where multiple forms of evidence continue to coexist without final hierarchy. In that sense, the Méduse does not simply belong to the past, it remains embedded within the ongoing practice of trying to understand it. Long after every account, image, and interpretation has been placed on record, the Méduse continues to exist in history as something that never fully resolves into the past.